So good day. Today we continue with our lectures in Advanced Business Economics. So this is lecture 9 and it is entitled Framework for Analysis of Expenditure Policy and Evaluating Public Expenditure, Part 1. I emphasize, please do the readings. The readings for this lecture are Stiglitz and Rosengard, chapters 10 to 11. So what we will cover is the 10 major elements in the analysis of public expenditure programs and also private cost-benefit analysis. As you know, funding programs, public expenditure programs, that comes with a cost, potentially increased taxes, so one has to look at the cost-benefit trade-off. So how can we break down the analysis of public expenditures in 10 steps? So first of all, we have to discuss the need of a program. What market failures are addressed by such a program? That is why we need a program. What are some of the alternatives to a public expenditure program that is instituted to address market failures? Then what we'll discuss is particular design features of the program. We'll speak about private sector responses to the implementation of a program, and there are a number, so we will mention these. We will also discuss the efficiency consequences, distributional consequences, the equity efficiency trade-offs, and public policy objectives and the political process that is involved in such programs. So let's talk about why we have a need for a program. So the Social Security program in the United States was introduced as a response to a stock market crash in 1929. So what would usually happen is that employees would work right until the end of their lives. There were no real provision as for retirement or any sort of security that would be provided should you become unemployed. And of course, following 1929, there was a very high level of unemployment. And this is what drove the establishment of the Social Security program in the United States. In other words, there was a general feeling that society had to make some provision for those who are unemployed and those who are now retiring or want to retire at least. Not that they really had the option. And hence the thinking was that it was better to formalize some kind of program in order to take care of those that are unemployed. So what we need to do is we need to recap as to what the sources of market failures are. And the reason why we need to do this is because we need to be able to assess whether government intervention is appropriate. So what are the sources of market failure? So first of all, we have imperfect competition, we have public goods, we have externalities, we have incomplete markets, imperfect competition, and macroeconomic disequilibrium, such as unemployment. So we need to add to that. Also, what we saw is that even if an economy is Pareto efficient, there are two further arguments for government intervention. So the distribution of income emerging from the market economy may not be socially equitable. In other words, we are not maximizing social welfare. We could be on a higher social welfare curve. Also, an individual's own perceptions of his or her welfare may be inappropriate or inadequate for making welfare judgments. So, for example, merit goods. So merit goods are goods that you believe you should have, that you want to have, but you might not be able to pay for them, nor will you be willing to pay for them. So the idea is that you might make the wrong welfare judgments because you are spending money on things you don't really need or you don't really have money to pay for. So before we can institute and formulate a plan of action in the form of a government intervention, what we need to do is we need to determine whether there is a market failure. And the reason why it is not always possible to see whether there is a market failure is because sometimes its nature is not so obvious. So, for example, national defense is a pure public good. Its absence would be obvious if defense is not being provided and won't be provided by a private sector. But then in other cases, economists do not agree on the nature of a market failure. So, for example, some economists may believe that education is a public good, whereas others may believe that it is a private good and should be provided privately and paid for by private individuals, as opposed to the government. So once we've identified that there is a market failure, we have to decide what type of government action is required. And the major categories of government action are as follows. So first of all, we have public production. So the government must decide on how output is to be allocated. So in this example, this would relate to the defense force. In other words, government would provide defense and will provide it for free. It can obviously also produce any other service or good that is not being produced because of a market failure. It can also decide to charge for these goods at market prices, and can also charge for these goods at something that approximates the cost of production. So that was the example that I used with regard to a telecoms monopoly. Ideally, what should happen is regulation should ensure that we are at the zero profit point. What government can also do is that it can engage in private production. So what here government must decide is whether it can contract for delivery of a commodity while retaining the responsibility for distributing it. An example would be the use of a tender process, whereas a government decides that they need to buy some good or service, and they get numerous companies to tender for that good or service, and then they choose the winner, and then that winner provides that service to government, who then allocates it. The same with goods. It provides specific goods to government, which are then allocated to society. It could also provide a subsidy to producers, and the idea here would be that some of the benefits will be passed on to consumers through lower prices. So let's say that currently a given good is being sold at £100. Well, what government can do is it can provide a subsidy of £20, and hence the price that is faced by the consumer is then £80. So therefore consumers benefit. The consumer benefits. Also, what government do is it can provide a subsidy to consumers directly. So, for example, it can give you an allowance for something that you can purchase every month. In other words, it no longer has to come out directly out of your income. Instead, you receive a subsidy from government. What government can also do is it can follow some kind of hybrid approach where there is a public-private partnership. And then what the government must do, it must decide on the nature of its relationship with the private sector, particularly regarding mutual roles and responsibilities, as well as the allocation of risk. So therefore, the risk is then spread between the public sector and the private sector. So once we've identified the type of program we want to institute, which will be optimal for a given market failure, what we need to do is we need to think about particular design features. So specifically, what we need to determine is eligibility standards. Who is it that qualifies for this program? And we must be also aware that there are trade-offs in designing such regulations. So these programs are set up to benefit individuals that are deserving. Now, if we make our regulations too loose, what will happen is then we will have undeserving individuals that start benefiting from a program. On the other hand, if we make regulations too tight, what will happen is that the number of deserving individuals not receiving aid will rise. In other words, the program will not be effective. So the question then we face is, how do we balance these regulations to make sure that the optimal number of those that are deserving receive aid? So now what we need to do is we need to introduce the private sector. So we, in a mixed economy, we have two operators. We have government, and also what we have is we have the private sector. Now this has an important implication, because what this means is that when government institutes a program, it doesn't have full control on the consequences. So, for example, public support might crowd out private support and hence erode the impact of a program. So let's say that what government does is it increases social security benefits. Whereas this is all well and good, but what this means is that those on welfare now do not save as much because they can rely on this increased benefit that is offered by government. Alternatively, what can happen is that public support may crowd in private support, so it might entice the private sector to act. So think of an example where government invests in developing some kind of basic technology or basic research. And then what happens? The private sector begins applying this research and using it in its production processes. So government action in this instance, support, has led to more positive activity by the private sector. So what are the efficiency consequences? Well, there are potentially two outcomes. So we have both a substitution and income effect that arises due to the institution of a government program to address market failures. So let's say that a government is providing subsidies. So that is the program we are first dealing with. So let's say you have a good that you originally paid £100 for, now you are paying £80 for it. What is it that happens if there's a subsidy that is provided because of government intervention so that you are now paying £80? Well, what arises is a so-called substitution effect. So the individual substitutes the cheaper good for other goods. In other words, individuals shift to consuming that good, more of that good, because it is now cheaper. So for example, let's say there's subsidy that is given to higher education. Individuals substitute education for other goods on which they might have spent their money. In other words, they now consume more education as a result of this being cheaper. Now let's look at another type of program. So when we talk about the substitution effect, we have essentially a government giving a subsidy. But what if the government gives us a grant? What is it that happens? Well, what happens is that individuals now have more income. So relative prices are not altered, but what we have is we have a so-called income effect. And the result is the individual will change the expenditure pattern, becoming better off. In other words, you have more money now because you received a grant. So that is why it's an income effect. Your income has gone up. In many instances, there's both an income and substitution effect, and both of these contribute to altering an individual's behavior. However, it is only the substitution effect that we associate with inefficiency. So let's begin with an initial budget constraint and talk about the so-called income effect. What is it that happens then if we have a budget constraint that corresponds to this line, and a consumer has the choice of consuming a set of goods called other goods and also groceries? So there are two types of goods: other goods, whatever that is, and also groceries that can be consumed. So the maximum amount of groceries corresponds to this point here, and the maximum amount of other goods corresponds to this point here. Now, where is the consumer on the indifference curve? At this point. This is where utility is being maximized, and that corresponds to quantity A of groceries consumed. Now, let's say that we give this consumer $10 worth of groceries, or simply $10 to buy groceries every single week. What happens then? Well, the result is that their budget constraint shifts outwards. And it shifts outward by $10 for groceries consumed. In other words, this is where we now begin. So we have a bit of a kinked budget constraint curve. You could view this as giving an individual an equivalent amount of income, and that is why our budget constraint curve is now shifting outwards. What is the result of that? Well, the result of that is that the consumer now is on a high indifference curve, which corresponds to a higher quantity of goods, of groceries. However, note that there is no inefficiency that is introduced because there is no substitution effect. So now let's talk about the substitution effect. So let's say again you have two goods. You have other goods, and then what we also have is groceries. And initially we start on this budget constraint curve. Now, this is the point that we are consuming, and we are consuming a mixture of both other goods and also of groceries. Now, let's assume the government decides to start subsidizing groceries. What is it that happens? Well, the budget constraint curve swivels outwards, and the result is that more groceries are now being consumed. So this is where we are consuming groceries. So this is the substitution effect that we are seeing. We are seeing more expenditure now on groceries and less expenditure on other goods, because groceries are now considered to be the cheaper good, or are the cheaper good. However, there is also an income effect. Because groceries are cheaper, what you also now have is money for other goods. So this is where our hypothetical consumer now consumes in terms of other goods. And that is above the initial point here that we started off with on our initial budget constraint curve before food subsidy was provided. So what we see is marginal incentives being altered. In other words, now the consumer not only consumes more groceries, but also potentially other goods. And these are the inefficiencies associated with the substitution effect. What about the distributional consequences? In other words, the question is, who is it that benefits from the implementation of government programs? That's what we need to consider here. And it is not always easy to assess who in fact is benefiting from a given government program. So let's look at a housing market, and we are looking at panel A, and assume that the supply or short-run supply curve represents a very inelastic supply. In other words, the quantity supplied is not responsive to changes in the price level. And here what we have is we have our demand curves, and we start off with this representing our initial demand for housing. Now let's say that what we do is we subsidize houses. And the effect of that subsidy is to increase the demand for housing. So what is the result of that? The result of this is that the demand curve shifts rightwards. Now, the equilibrium quantity of housing hasn't really changed. So not much more housing is essentially being purchased. We go from this point, which I circled here, to this point. But on the other hand, what has happened is that the price has increased drastically. So not many more people are buying houses, yet what has happened is that the price has increased drastically. So in other words, this program does not have the intended consequences of making housing more accessible. And that is because the short-run supply is inelastic. In other words, we have a steep supply curve. Now, let us look at a situation where we have elastic prices. In other words, the quantity supplied does respond to changes in the price level. So let's say that now in the long run, the supply or the quantity supplied of housing responds to changes in the price level. So what that means is that the supply curve is a lot flatter. So what is it that happens if we provide a subsidy? Well, again, what we have is we have our initial demand curve, and now that initial demand curve shifts to the right. So demand shifts outwards. What is the result of that? That the quantity of housing increases. Specifically, there are more people now that own houses. So if we talk about a market that comprises of both owners and renters, in this situation, what happens is that renters benefit because they can stop renting and they can purchase a house. So note the increase in the amount of housing or the equilibrium quantity of housing is greater than the increase in the prices that arise as a result of an increase in demand. So this differs from the situation in panel A, which is a short-run situation. So the point is that the distributional effects differ according to time and according to who is being impacted. Different groups will be impacted differently. Now let's talk about the equity efficiency trade-offs. And what is important to realize here, there are views that differ on public programs. So specifically, we come across trade-offs between the objectives of efficiency and also equity. So as an example, high unemployment compensation may provide increased income to some who are among the most needy, but unemployment insurance may give some individuals less incentive to find another job. So as you can see, there is a bit of a trade-off here that arises. So how can we demonstrate this theoretically? So let's say we have a equity efficiency frontier that starts here and ends here in panel A. And then we have two individuals. We have Scrooge and we also have Spendthrift. And what we assume is that Scrooge is much less willing to give up efficiency for a gain in equity than his brother Spendthrift. So this is where Scrooge is. He is in favor of efficiency. On the other hand, Spendthrift is in favor of equity. So this is where Spendthrift is. So these are their respective optimal points. Now, how do you represent or how do we tie this in about disagreements about policy? Well, this is represented by the indifference curves themselves. And we clearly see that Scrooge values efficiency, whereas Spendthrift values equity. And the question is, how do we represent the reasons as to why these differences about policy arise? Well, what we can do is we can represent them in terms of perception. So, for example, Scrooge thinks that to get a slight increase in equity, one must give up a lot of efficiency. So, hence, his equity efficiency frontier is steeper. That's how he perceives it to be. Note that's perceptions. On the other hand, Spendthrift thinks that one can get a large increase in equity with just a slight loss of efficiency. And therefore, his equity efficiency frontier, perceived equity efficiency frontier, is flatter. This is where Spendthrift is. So think about it this way. A slight decrease in efficiency for Spendthrift results in a theoretically larger increase in equity. On the other hand, a slight decrease in equity for Scrooge results in a larger gain in efficiency. That is how they perceive it. So hence, that is why the slope of these perceived equity efficiency frontiers has a bearing. So therefore, these differences about policy arise from judgments concerning the nature of the trade-offs. So now let's talk about objectives. So we've spoken about two objectives of public programs. We focused on their impact on economic efficiency and also on their impact on distribution. So that is what we dealt with. However, government policy may be also concerned with a broader range of objectives. So government may be concerned with the extent to which individuals of a different racial, ethnic, and class backgrounds are mixed together in schools. So this goes beyond economic efficiency and also the effect of government programs on distribution. So therefore, what we do is we extend the realm of public policy to other objectives. That's essentially what we are talking about, not only economic aspects. So if we have a set of alternative objectives that are clearly defined, then what government can still make use of are a variety of instruments for achieving them. So for example, there might be a regulatory requirement that certain groups or firms that meet certain characteristics or certain individuals will receive subsidies or will receive business as a result of these regulations. In other words, we can view this as a matter of positive discrimination, or discrimination that is aimed at promoting previously disadvantaged groups and giving them an opportunity to do business. So it gives preference to either individuals, firms, or certain groups. Now note, what we also need to do is we need to mention the impact of the so-called political process. Remember that the political process is influenced by a number of factors. So in a democracy, what will happen is that the design and adoption of public expenditure programs involves many individuals and groups with various objectives and various beliefs about how the economy works. And it is these beliefs and objectives that tend to filter into this process. And of course, this has an impact on the programs that are implemented. So hence, programs tend to be structured to either appease the general population, of course, that has an impact, or the voters specifically, a voting bloc, or alternatively, the political process is also shaped by special interests. So the programs that emerge reflect those special interests. And finally, what we can also have is we have corruption coming into play. So not only are programs impacted by the political process itself, which means that the appropriate programs might not emerge, but the popular programs might, for example, be accepted. What we also have is we have programs being subject to corruption. And this corruption can take many forms. So for example, special interests contribute to campaigns, and what they try to do is they try to get a party elected that will pass legislation that favors them. Also, what bureaucrats do is they use their discretionary powers to extend favors in return for bribes. Now let's evaluate public expenditure. Are these programs effective? So note the text that corresponds to this is chapter 11 of Stiglitz and Rosengard, the textbook that we are using now. So let's continue. So now in Chapter 10, what we did is we set out the basic framework for analysis of government expenditure. Specifically, we looked at efficiency and distributional aspects. Now what we need to talk about is how do we assess the performance of government expenditure projects? And the intention is to improve future government performance. So first of all, before we do look at how government projects are evaluated, let's talk about a private cost-benefit analysis, because I think the principle is the same. So how is it that a private firm makes decisions concerning a project to undertake? Obviously, there are a number of projects that a firm can undertake, a private firm can undertake, but the amount of funds is limited. So what we need is some kind of criteria. So what are some of the 4 steps that can be followed? First of all, you need to identify the set of possible projects to be considered. So, for example, if a steel firm wishes to expand its production capacity, there may be a number of ways to do it. Which way is the best? So that's what we need to look at. What we then need to do is we need to identify the full consequences of each alternative. So which alternative is best? We can quantify that using monetary values. And that leads us to the third point. So what we do is we assign a value to each input and output. So the firm will estimate the costs of various kinds of labor, in other words, the inputs, and the cost of other inputs. In our steel example, it might be coal and iron ore, and the prices which it can sell it at. What will it then do in the 4th step is it will add up all these costs and benefits and estimate the total profitability of this project. And what we'll then aim to do is to undertake the most profitable project out of those.